A2IM, the collective voice of independent music.
Hi, everybody. My name is George York, and I am the Senior Vice President for International Policy at the Recording Industry Association of America. I've been at RIAA now for about 3 years, and before then I was at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative's Office in the U.S. government, which is responsible for negotiating trade agreements for the U.S. government. I was there for about a dozen years and also spent some time in the U.S. Congress as one of the staffers on the Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee, and got to work on trade agreements there as well. I'm also one of the organizers of the Digital Creators Coalition, the DCC, based here in Washington. And we're a broad and diverse array of creative community organizations from the United States representing the broad music community, movies, TV, video games, books, sports leagues, labor groups, and broader associations. So that's another area I work on in terms of focusing on international copyright and trade issues. I wanted to thank Richard Burgess and the entire A2IM team for inviting me to participate in this year's Indie Week, and also commend them for holding this first ever virtual incarnation of Indie Week. I'm so glad that that's happening, and I'm getting to join in on this historic moment. So today's discussion topic is politics in music, equitable global performance royalties. And in discussing this topic, I will focus on how trade agreements between the United States and other countries offer both tremendous opportunity for the music community, as well as can present considerable risk for our community. Specifically, I've been asked to answer a couple of questions. As our industry globalizes, reciprocal rights and the conversation surrounding the lack of a U.S. terrestrial radio performance right becomes more and more pressing. What effect do global trade agreements have on these conversations, and how are copyright safe harbors being exported? In answering these questions, I'll take up three main issues. The first, I'll provide a little background on trade agreements and how they're negotiated. Second, I'll turn to how protections for the music community and creators generally in trade agreements, including copyright protection and enforcement, are addressed in these agreements. And finally, hopefully the best part of the show will be when I get to the question of why these agreements matter to you, why they matter to everyone in the music community, no matter where you reside in the community. In other words, how can songwriters and publishers and performers of all varieties, labels, both large and small, and others in the music ecosystem be directly and even significantly affected by what happens in trade agreements and perhaps even the larger ebb and flow of international policymaking, including with respect to our topics today on performance rights and copyright safe harbors. So let me turn to that first set of issues, which is what are trade agreements and how does the negotiating process actually work? So what are trade agreements? These are legal documents, right? They can go on for hundreds of pages. They are legally binding. They represent U.S. law. The U.S. government cannot take on commitments in trade agreements with foreign countries that go beyond U.S. law. And often they have to fully reflect U.S. law, at least in its key parts. I should note that trade agreements are detailed, but they're nowhere near as detailed as U.S. law itself, and certainly not as detailed as regulations and other judicial decisions, which also form the corpus of U.S. law, as you all know. Typically, trade agreements have 35 or so chapters, and those chapters are on agricultural products and market access and goods and specific types of goods. They're also on services, things like legal services and architectural services and distribution services, service providers. And finally, the third category is what I would call kind of rules of the road. And that's where intellectual property rights and copyright specifically fit in. And that's where, for the music community, I would say that's where we spend most of our time focusing. Also important for our community is the digital trade chapter, which includes many disciplines about how digital content is traded across borders and the rules of the road for that. Another area of great importance for our community. So basically, it's important to know also how the U.S. enters these negotiations. It enters these negotiations almost always as a rule giver, not a rule taker. When we negotiate with countries that are smaller economically and perhaps even less economically developed, the U.S. government goes in and asks, sometimes politely even, that country take on U.S. law. And that may not be the law of the land in that particular jurisdiction. And so negotiations are extensive and usually result in a trade that these countries take on U.S. standards, including on intellectual property protection, but on a lot of issues in exchange for market access for the goods and services from that country, whether it's Costa Rica or China or the UK or Japan. That's usually the nature of the exchange. And second, many countries enter into negotiations with the United States because they don't want the United States to sanction them. And by sanctions, I mean apply trade tariffs on goods coming into the United States. Germany doesn't want tariffs imposed to increase the cost of Mercedes and BMW in the United States. Italy doesn't want Pellegrino to be more expensive in the United States. Japan doesn't want its cars, Toyota, Honda, etc., to be more expensive in the United States, and rather, through trade agreements, they can lower the cost of those goods as well as services in the U.S. market, which is full of eager consumers and is a huge, important market for just about every exporter. I should also note that the U.S. has agreed to about 15 trade agreements with foreign countries, from Israel to Bahrain to Canada and Mexico, many countries in Central America, Chile, and many others. It also has about 6 trade agreements that are in some stage of negotiation at the moment. That includes the United Kingdom, Japan, China, the European Union, India, and even Kenya. Those negotiations haven't started, but could start as early as June of 2020. Finally, I guess we should turn to, so how are trade agreements negotiated? Basically, I would say that there are roughly about 6 phases. These are my own categories that I've created. They're governed in the United States by a statute called the Trade Promotion Authority Act. And that act does one basic thing, which it allows the U.S. government to negotiate trade agreements without Congress doing a line-by-line editing of those trade agreements once they're negotiated. It takes the 2/3 constitutional treaty ratification authority of the Senate and gives a majority vote approval to both the House and the Senate to accept these trade deals with certain requirements. It sets negotiating objectives for the U.S. administration in terms of what it must achieve in the negotiations and how it must be consistent with U.S. law. And it also sets a series of procedural requirements about dates and timings for different aspects of the negotiation. Critical is that the administration consult extensively with Congress. Sometimes that happens more than others. So what are those 6 phases that I mentioned? So first we have the pre-negotiation phase. That's before the negotiations even begin. So that happens through the U.S. interagency. The U.S. Trade Representative Office talks with the Commerce Department, the National Economic Council, the White House, the Patent and Trademark Office, the Defense Department, the Department of Agriculture. Every agency that has any interest in international anything has to be a part of that process. The U.S. government has to come to a single consensus position on its priorities in that negotiation before negotiations can start. The administration must also negotiate extensively in advance with Congress, with stakeholders, including through public requests for public comments, as well as with the other country. So with the UK and with the EU, there were extensive pre-discussions, part of what are called trade and investment working groups, where the negotiators get to know each other and understand how each other's systems work. Then the negotiations begin, and there's a bit of a honeymoon period where each side is excited, has a lot of political will, there's a lot of momentum, and they spend a lot of time talking about what each other's legal systems look like. Then there's the phase that I like to call the slog, and this is the thing that goes on, where negotiators are locked in rooms, very little public access to those negotiations, where they literally go line by line over text What's your text? What's our text? What's the landing zone? Where can we agree? Where do we have to escalate this to send it to politicals? They're working on footnotes. It's pretty dull, but for trade negotiators, this is the bread and butter work and can often be extremely exciting and even on occasion, I think, offer opportunities for some creativity. After the slog, which can go on for quite a long time, as I've mentioned, you have the end game. This is where it looks like the negotiations are going to come to a conclusion. The politicals are involved, leaders are involved, Prime Minister Johnson, President Trump, et cetera, will be involved and could be involved in making key decisions, even on very technical issues, including on copyright. We've seen this happen in the context of copyright safe harbors, for example. Congress then becomes involved. They must adopt the trade agreement. And that, as we've seen in the context of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, is extensive and very politically challenging. At the end of the day, Congress rewrote many key aspects of the trade agreement that Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. had previously agreed, much to Canada and Mexico's chagrin, I'm sure. This included rewriting aspects of the intellectual property rights chapter for the pharmaceutical patent industry. There was nothing done on copyright. However, it's very much possible. So we must always keep that in mind. Finally, the last phase is what we call implementation and certification. Canada and Mexico must implement the context of the deal that it agreed to with the United States. And the U.S. government must certify that Canada have implemented in its law all of its obligations. This includes with respect to the issue of national treatment, which is a huge win with respect to that question about terrestrial radio performance rights in Canada. So moving to that second phase that I wanted to talk about today, this is copyright protections and trade agreements. So we've talked a little bit about what are trade agreements, but now let's talk a little bit about what the copyright aspects are. Is the music community and creators generally, how are they protected in these agreements? And also potentially, how are they harmed? So first there are the threshold rules. These are things like treaties. Every party to a trade agreement with the U.S. must commit to ratify these particular treaties. The World Trade Organization TRIPS agreement, which is an IP agreement, or the Berne Convention, or the WIPO Copyright Treaty, or the WIPO Performances and Phonograms Treaty. Also, and these threshold rules are about the nature and scope of obligations. FTAs establish a floor, but not a ceiling. So every party to the negotiations can establish protections that are more extensive and stronger than what's in the agreement, as long as they're not inconsistent with the agreement. And this is another area that's important for us in our topic today, national treatment. National treatment means, for example, Canadian rights holders, or I should say U.S. rights holders, must be treated no less favorably than Canadian rights holders in Canada. As a result, Canada had to, of the USMCA, provide full national treatment, which provides that producers and performers receive remuneration for terrestrial radio for the play of U.S. repertoire in Canada. That is the end of a major piece of discrimination, and we'll talk more about that later. Then you have the actual copyright protections beyond the threshold provisions. And so I should note here that IP chapters in trade agreements, one of those 35 chapters in a trade agreement, provide protections across all IP rights. So that's patents, trademarks, trade secrets, geographical indications, which is a bizarre IP protection for things like cheese and champagne and other delicious products, and also copyrights. Copyright rights in these agreements cover a broad array of rights. Again, not as extensive as in US law in terms of the detail, but in terms of the breadth are pretty accurate. So here we have the reproduction right, the communication to the public right, the distribution right, the related rights, also exceptions and limitations. A battleground issue has long been, what do those exceptions and limitations include? In the USMCA, it included what's called the three-step test, an internationally recognized framework for copyrights exceptions, something that is supported by the creative communities of the US, but it does not include open-ended fair use provisions. While these provisions are in U.S. law, as people know, they are often misimplemented in foreign jurisdictions. This administration took a choice not to export broad, open-ended fair use provisions, which we felt were not fully consistent with the full corpus of U.S. jurisprudence with respect to that particular exception in U.S. law. Finally, we have things like term. So again, in Canada, they extended the term of copyright protection for both works and sound recordings. We'll talk more about that in a second. Finally, there's copyright enforcement. These are provisions, again, on copyright and IP rights generally that are in these trade agreements. So we have provisions on civil enforcement, on criminal enforcement, on border enforcement. So these are all critical features of our enforcement provisions. And finally, as part of that, copyright safe harbors, ISP liability. These have been in trade agreements really almost since the beginning of the DMCA, Digital Millennium Copyright Act. They have evolved over time. So, for example, the Chilean FTA on safe harbors is the low watermark, is very much not the model. It's a very problematic, which is effectively, thanks to that FTA, shut down really strong copyright enforcement online in the Chilean market. We have the Australian model, which was a very good model, which limited the eligibility for copyright safe harbors to only non-economic actors. We have the China model recently, which did not include liability or immunity provisions, but instead limited enforcement online for copyright to notice and takedown. And finally, we saw in the USMCA, we saw the inclusion of copyright safe harbors for Mexico, potentially problematic, although we're waiting to see the implementing legislation. However, a grandfather clause for Canada, which said Canada's system, which is problematic, nonetheless, does not need to be consistent with the DMCA, which itself is a victory. So finally, let's get to the most important part of today's conversation, which is why do trade agreements matter? And as I've mentioned, why do they matter to you? Why do they matter to all sorts of citizens of the music community? They matter because they can affect your rights. They matter because they can affect how you license and the remuneration you can receive in those foreign markets, and potentially even one day in the United States market. So I'll discuss basically two case studies fairly quickly in terms of that illustrate both the significant impact and possible negative risks on the music community. The first one, of course, is the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement. As I've mentioned, it's been negotiated by the parties. All three countries have passed it through their legislative systems, including the US Congress, and now Canada and Mexico are implementing the agreement. The US has already done so. So let's get right to it. Performance rights. In Canada, for the past 20 years or more, U.S. Repertoire was not eligible for remuneration for producers or performers in Canada, whereas Canadian Repertoire was eligible. The U.S. government worked hard and achieved a commitment to provide full national treatment, which means that had to end. That discrimination is over. Canada passed a ministerial declaration which ended that discrimination. And now, as a result, the music community in the United States is able to receive, both producers and performers, able to receive remuneration for U.S. repertoire played on terrestrial radio in Canada to the tune of about $24 million Canadian. So that's real money. That's real money in the pockets. That's an important win, and it can show how trade agreements can very much affect the conversation, but more importantly, not just the conversation, but the economic reality of the music industry in these markets. Another great area of success in Canada was on copyright term. For musical works, Canada extended the term of copyright protection as a result of the trade agreement from 50 to 70 years, and for sound recordings from publication, from 70 to 75 years. Two big wins, especially for our songwriters and for our publishers. Safe harbors, as I've mentioned, the US-Canada agreement exported, in some sense, the DMCA, the US safe harbor system, to Mexico, but not really to Canada. And finally, a little extra win there was with respect to the Pre72 rights that we secured in the Music Modernization Act here in the United States. Canada had long discriminated against Pre-72 sound recordings in Canada from the US, Now it will also provide that protection as a result of the trade agreement. Now, looking ahead to the US-UK trade negotiation, this negotiation was launched in May. It had its first round of negotiations just a few weeks ago. Its second round of negotiations will happen just in a short time, from June 15th to June 22nd. Here, the performance right and the lack of the terrestrial radio broadcast right here in the United States will very much be on the table. It's unclear how much the UK will press this, knowing that it's up against a very challenging resistance in our Congress. That being said, in its text, the UK text to the European Union, the US did include a full performance right for broadcasters with respect to broadcast and communication to the public for producers and performers. So that is an important landmark on the horizon with respect to that negotiation. Likewise, the UK very much opposes the incorporation of the US DMCA and its copyright safe harbor system into UK law. There are fundamental divergences between the US system and the UK system, and creators and including in the music community, very much oppose the inclusion of that in the UK system. So that will be very much of a frontline issue, including because of all the scrutiny happening in the United States, including with respect to the, as you all know, the US Copyright Office 512 study and the multitude of hearings happening in our Congress on Section 512 as well. Obviously, we're looking forward to seeing the fact that the UK has injunctive relief or website blocking in its jurisdiction, and that's something that was addressed in the Copyright Office study as well. And likewise, we'd like to see term extended for sound recordings in the UK, consistent with US law, and also that the UK has statutory damages. So let me conclude by affirmatively answering the questions that were presented, which is that trade agreements can significantly impact the music community. Negotiations are indeed shaped by the lack of the US terrestrial public performance right here for radio, for producers and performers, and it's something that inhibits the United States from agreeing to certain aspects and greater commitments. Likewise, the performance right will certainly come up in the US-UK negotiations, where the UK will likely, at least in the beginning, we have to manage our expectations toward the end, request reciprocity, which is if it's going to be in the UK, it should also be in the US. We also know that the US is actively promoting copyright safe harbors in other jurisdictions. We've talked extensively about that today, and I look forward to your questions on that. We've seen the highly problematic versions of that with respect to Chile. We've also seen how this administration has changed its paradigm over the course of the administration in terms of different ideas in terms of Japan, Canada, China, and hopefully the UK. So I want to conclude today by thanking everyone for listening. I want to thank A2IM again for inviting me to join this presentation, and I look forward to any questions, and I hope everyone has a great Indie Week. So many thanks again.